Hi everyone, we're continuing our series of beginner chess videos on My Chess Notebook. I think we have enough lessons under our belt that we can play through an entire game of chess and learn what it looks like. What are the two players thinking about and how do we conduct a game? And I've selected perhaps the most famous or one of the most famous chess games ever played. This game was played in 1858, and it was played by, at the time, someone considered to be the unofficial world champion of chess. His name was Paul Morphy. Paul Morphy lived from 1837 to 1884, and this particular game was played in 1858 in Paris, and Paul Morphy had the white pieces, and his opponents were Duke Karl and Count Isouard, which were two noble, very strong amateur players. And this game has a name. It's called the Opera Game because it was played in an opera house in Paris. All right, let's play through the moves. By the way, I recommend looking up Paul Morphy on his Wikipedia page. I'll put the link in the description of the video below. It's kind of fun as a beginner chess player when you're first learning the game to get to know the different personalities and the history of the game. Okay, so Paul Morphy has the white pieces. He's the strongest player in the world. Let's see how he plays. Okay, his first move is to push his pawn in front of his king 2 squares, and it ends up on the e4 square. Okay, and that's a very strong move to play, and I recommend making that move in most of your games as a beginner. It's good to get a pawn in the center of the board. Also, it starts to open up your pieces. This bishop now has a diagonal to get into the game, and the queen has a diagonal as well to get into the game. At the beginning of the game, you have this wall of pawns that are blocking in all of your pieces except for the knights, which can hop over that wall. So we talk about how to move the pawns out of the way and make room for the pieces to come into the game. Okay, and black responded with the same move, moving his pawn in front of his king 2 squares for the same reasons. Okay, now Morphy plays his knight out to the f3 square. Okay, so his knight is getting into the game now, and it's doing something. Notice that knight is attacking that black pawn. If white had another move, he would capture it. So black does something about that. He defends the pawn with the move pawn here up to the d6 square. So that pawn would recapture if Morphy took that pawn. And Morphy doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to give up a knight for a pawn because a knight is worth 3 points and a pawn is worth 1 point, remember. So instead, Morphy plays another pawn up 2 squares to the center of the board. In chess, you like to control the center of the board. That means you like to put your pawns in the center and you like to aim your pieces towards the center. And the reason for that is if you control the center of the board, then you could easily pass through the center and get from one side of the board to the other. And it's kind of like in tennis. I think of this as a good analogy. In tennis, if you're standing in the middle of the court waiting for your opponent to return the ball, then you're ready to run to the left or run to the right. But if you're standing on the side of the court, on the left side of the court, then the whole right side is wide open and your opponent is going to hit the ball down the right-hand side. So get your pieces toward the center like this. Okay, and this pawn that just got pushed forward is making a threat. It's threatening again to take that pawn. Now notice white has 2 pieces threatening that pawn, and black only has 1 defender. That means if white plays his pawn, takes this pawn, and black recaptures with his pawn, then this knight would still be here ready to take the other pawn that ends up there. So black has to do something about that, and he plays his bishop out to this g4 square. And this brings up another interesting point. This bishop is not only attacking that knight, but we say the bishop is pinning the knight. The knight is pinned to its spot. It probably doesn't want to move. Do you see why white doesn't want to move this knight out of the way? Yeah, if that knight moved out of the way, the black bishop would be able to capture the very powerful queen worth 9 points. So white doesn't want to do that. So the knight better stay there for now. Okay, so instead, Morphy uses his pawn here on d4 to take that black pawn. Okay, and black decides to play the bishop takes the knight, and Morphy takes back, and that's called a trade. And it's an even trade because a knight and a bishop are both worth 3 points. Now the black pawn here is going to capture this white pawn. Let's see that. Okay, so if you look at the position, each player has lost 1 pawn, and white has lost a knight, and black has lost a bishop. That's 4 points each that they have lost. So it's an even score as far as the material goes. Okay, but it's white's move, and white gets another piece into the action. He moves this bishop out to the c4 square. Now I want you to look closely at this bishop and this queen and ask yourself, what are they pointed at? What is white threatening? Okay, if you watched my last video about checkmates, then you remember scholar's mate. Scholar's mate is a 4-move checkmate where the queen and the bishop team up against this pawn right here. And this is very similar. It's taken a couple of extra moves, but it's the same idea. White is threatening to play queen takes this pawn on f7, and that would be a checkmate because the bishop is supporting the queen. The king would not be able to recapture, and the king has no escape squares. The queen would have all the squares covered. So black has to do something about this checkmate threat, and he decides to move his knight out into the game and put it on the f6 square. And that blocks the queen's access to that pawn. So it is one way to defend against that checkmate. So the queen can no longer get to that pawn. All right, but Paul Morphy slides the queen over to the b3 square here. And now notice the queen and the bishop are lined up again, both pointed at that same square. When you line up 2 pieces like this, like a queen and a bishop, or a queen and a rook, or maybe 2 rooks, and they're pointed in the same direction, you call that a battery. So white is creating a battery, and he is threatening to play bishop takes this pawn and calls check. The king would not be able to take the bishop because the queen is guarding it. However, that would not be a checkmate because the king would be able to move away somewhere. But nevertheless, white is threatening to win that pawn. Okay, do you see another pawn that white is threatening to win? Okay, hopefully you noticed this pawn is also under attack by the white queen. So there's a double attack, we say, going on in the position. White is threatening 2 things at once. And getting double attacks is an extremely important idea in chess. If you can attack 2 things at once, and you do that a lot in your games, your opponent will not be able to defend against both all the time. And that's how you actually win pieces in chess, with double attacks. Okay, so black decides to move their queen up in front of the king like this to e7. And that queen is now protecting this pawn, and so is the king. So it has 2 defenders. And so black says, I think this pawn is more important. I'm going to defend that one and not this one. Okay, and white decides to play his other knight into the game, knight to c3. Okay, Morphy decided not to take that pawn, and we won't go into all the reasons. This is just an introduction here to this game. We could study this game for years and learn more about it each time we look at it. But Morphy's goal in a game of chess is to get all of his pieces off of their original squares and into the game. He wants to move all of his pieces, not just a couple of them. In fact, that's what made Morphy so much better than all of his contemporaries in the middle of the 19th century. He understood intuitively that you have to bring your whole army into the game to attack your opponent. You can't just bring a couple of pieces out and use your 2 pieces to attack. You have to get everything into the game. Okay, so after Morphy moved his knight there, Black plays a clever little pawn move. He pushes this pawn forward 1 square. Why is that so clever? Well, notice that opens a defense now. The queen is now defending that pawn, so the white queen can't take it. But also, this pawn is restricting this knight from coming forward. The knight can't come here without being taken by the pawn, and it can't come there either without being taken by the pawn. So it's a clever little move. But Morphy now gets this bishop into the game by playing it over here. And that's a pin. Now white is making a pin. White is pinning that knight. Black can move the knight if he wants to, but he better be prepared to lose his 9-point queen, which is sitting behind it. So he probably doesn't want to move that knight. Okay, so now Black tries something here. He pushes this pawn forward 2 squares to attack that bishop. And he reasons that this pawn is defended by the other pawn. And so he wants to drive this bishop backward somewhere, maybe to this square or this square or this square. He wants to drive it away. However, Morphy plays an excellent move here. He takes that pawn with his knight, which doesn't look good at first because the black pawn can now take the knight, and the knight's worth 3 points and the pawn's only worth 1. But let's see what happens. Why did Morphy do that? Well, black does take the knight with this pawn, and then Morphy takes the other pawn with his bishop and calls check. Notice the king is under attack. So it turns out white got 2 pawns for the knight. Well, still a knight's 3 points and pawns are 1 point each, so it looks like white gave up 3 points and only got 2 in return. But remember, the point count is not everything in chess. Okay, this is a great game to illustrate that the amount of points you have, the material you have, we say, is not the most important thing. The most important thing is checkmating your opponent's king. And Morphy can see ahead and can understand that he's going to be attacking this king and there won't be much of a defense. All right, so Morphy says it's more important to have all of my pieces in the game pointed towards that king than it is to worry about the point count. Okay, so black has to get out of check. And remember, when you're in check, there are three ways to get out of check. Move the king, block the check, or take the piece that's calling check. Well, black decides to block the check with his knight. Moves his knight to the d7 square. Okay, and now Morphy decides to castle with this rook. When you castle with that rook over there, you call that long castling. If you castle with this other rook, you call that short castling, because it's shorter distance between the king and the rook. So remember how this works. This king is going to move 2 squares towards that rook and end up right there, and the rook is going to go to the other side of the king, like that. Now, the purpose of that move is to get the king a little safer behind this wall of pawns, but also to move the rook into the game. The rook is now pointed down this file right at that knight. So black decides to move their rook over to help defend the knight. Now, a lot of things are defending that knight. The rook is defending, the queen is defending, the king is defending, and this knight is defending. Nevertheless, Morphy takes the knight anyway, and he does it with his rook. Now, usually you don't want to do that. It's a 5-point rook for a 3-point knight, and you're going to lose your rook for that knight. Usually you use your lower valued piece to take. The bishop is only worth 3 points. If you're going to make a trade, usually use your lower value. But there are very concrete reasons why taking with the rook is best. Let's see what happens. The rook takes the knight. Now, black recovers the material and takes the rook. And actually that's a 2-point gain for black. But the problem is that rook is now in a pin. Do you see this white bishop? It's pointed at that king. The rook is not allowed to move even if he wanted to, because if this rook moves out of the way somewhere, then that king would be in check. And you're not allowed to put your king in check. There's actually 2 pins in the position. That rook is pinned, and this knight is pinned because if it moves, white gets the queen. But there's a difference in those pins. The pin on the rook is called an absolute pin, and that's because the rook can absolutely not move. It's illegal. But the pin on the knight is called a relative pin, and that's because it can move if it wants to. It's not illegal to move that knight, but it probably doesn't want to because you lose that 9-point queen. Okay, so Morphy now gets this rook into the game by moving it over to the d1 square and pointing it at that rook that's pinned. And now he's got all these pieces pointed at that pinned rook. Now, there's not much defending that rook. This knight really is not doing a good job defending because if it ever recaptures, black will lose his queen. So because of that, black tries to move their queen forward 1 square to release the pin on the knight. So now the knight is free to move and maybe recapture if white takes the rook. So the queen will no longer get taken. So we say that black broke the pin. But Morphy now plays bishop takes rook check. Okay, and that bishop is not only checking the king, but it's also threatening the queen at the same time. So if black moves the king out of the way, then white could take the queen, which is worth a lot of points. So instead, black tries knight captures the bishop, since the knight has been released from its pin when the queen moved out of the way. So it takes the bishop, but that allows Morphy a very pretty finish to the game. He plays the move that probably shocked the black players. By the way, it's not normal to have 2 people play on one side of a chess game, but sometimes they do it. They're playing cooperatively. They're discussing their moves together and they're deciding what's best. But the black players did not see this coming. Queen goes to the b8 square with check. And the reason that's a hard move to see coming is because it looks like that square is covered by the knight. And it looks like the queen is just being given up here. Well, it's called a queen sacrifice when you do that, when you give up your queen, in order to get something better than your queen. It's called a queen sacrifice. And the knight here is actually forced to take it because there's no other way to get out of check. You cannot block the check. And the king can't move anywhere. Oops, it can't move to these squares. Notice the bishop has that square covered. So there's only one way to get out of check, which is the knight takes the queen. But then white has a checkmating move. Can you find the move that checkmates black? Pause your video and try to find it. Okay, it's not too hard to find if you just look at each of your pieces and imagine where they can go And remember, a checkmate has to first and foremost be a check. And there's only one way to attack the black king, which is with this rook. And the checkmating move is the rook goes all the way up to here, and that's a checkmate. Why is it a checkmate? Well, it's a check, and the king can't capture the rook because the bishop has it defended. And the king can't come forward because the bishop has that square defended, and the king can't go there because the rook has that square defended. There's no way to get out of check, and it's checkmate. So look at the final position here. If you were to compare the pieces, you would see that black's points are much higher than white's. Black still has the queen, white doesn't. Black has an extra knight that white doesn't have. But it's not the score that matters, it's the checkmate that matters here, and white planned it perfectly. That's how the best player in the 19th century played chess. All right, thanks for watching this game. I hope to see you for the next video.